The movie opens with a group of people gathered together, engaging in what appears to be a ritualistic activity. They chant and clap with loud instruments being played in the background. As the atmosphere intensifies, suddenly a door creaks open behind them. The woman who is leading the group takes a bold step inside. Before she leaves, she instructs the people to keep up with the loud chants and claps. As the woman walks through the door, it forcefully shuts behind her, startling the rest of the group outside who just continue to observe the scene. No one is at rest as they all anxiously anticipate the woman's return. Suddenly, there's a scream from inside. Two people hastily make their way to the door, and as they open it, they find the woman in an unsettling state. Her eyes are wide open like she has seen a ghost. Or maybe she has become a ghost, as she is no longer breathing. The movie transitions into a cafe where we see So-hee working her shift. While attending to customers at the counter, her attention is brought to Sang-yeob, who has been awkwardly stalking her. As their eyes meet, Sang-yeob shyly hides behind his laptop. Later, the two walk out of the cafe together. As they talk, Sang-yeob tries to make it seem like it's a coincidence that they met, but So-hee outrightly points out to him that she had informed him before that she worked there, and so it was no coincidence that they met. Relieving Sang-yeob the tension he feels, So-hee changes the subject and inquires what Sang-yeob was working on inside the cafe. The boy reveals that he has been working on a horror novel. Surprised by this, So-hee inquires if Sang-yeob dreams of becoming a writer, but he claims that he only writes for fun. So-hee is intrigued that an engineering student fancies writing. However, Sang-yeob reveals his struggles with completing books when he starts, and So-hee, connecting the dots, asks if that's why he joined the club 0.0 MHz. But the boy says it's only one of the reasons he joined, and not necessarily his main reason for joining. When he asks So-hee her reason for joining the club, she claims to have joined just for fun. The two arrive at the club meeting. After they're welcomed, they are introduced to a case of an abandoned house in Wuhari. From the tragic incident of the woman who lived there and how she took her own life, the apartment became haunted as a ghost began to dwell there. Tae-soo, who has been narrating all along, explains that when the people of that village called an exorcist to chase the ghost out of the apartment, more tragedy fell, and the shaman never made it out of the house. Tae-soo, using video clips and images to back up his narration, explains that one of the villagers posted a photo of the tragic passing of the shaman on the internet. To Sang-yeob's dismay, the first project of the club is to brainwave a test at that very haunted house. Tae-soo explains to Sang-yeob why the club is called 0.0 MHz. He says it's because 0.0 MHz is the frequency at which a person's soul meets a ghost. Despite all this, So-hee remains unfazed. Perhaps she doesn't believe in ghosts, or maybe she isn't afraid. Soon, the group begins their adventure. On the way, they make a quick stop at a store to purchase necessities for the trip. Meanwhile, So-hee waits outside. While waiting, So-hee notices a girl with a strange wound on her leg walking into the store. Inside the store, the others are grabbing drinks and are asked by the owner what brings them to the place. The man can tell they are not from around there. They reveal that they want to go inspect an abandoned apartment. The store owner is astonished by their plans and wonders why they would want to go there. He advises them to quit this seeming adventure, explaining that the place is full of tragedy and not suitable for tourists or sightseeing. The man is concerned about the group and insists that they stay away from the apartment and not disrespect the deceased, but the group is rather offended by the man's concern, and so they quickly pay for their drinks and leave. As they drive off, the man and the girl that had earlier entered the store watch them leave. They observe them sternly as the 0.0 MHz group zooms off. After a while, the group arrives and parks 5 minutes away from the building. They take out their luggage and continue the rest of the journey on foot. When they get to the house, they are in awe as they claim the house looks scarier in real life than it does in pictures. Everyone decides to explore the apartment for themselves, going to different parts of the place. On the other hand, So-hee suddenly glimpses a dark figure inside the apartment. As if losing control over herself, she wanders into the woods, unsteady in her movement. Just then, an elderly woman dressed in white appears in front of her and grabs her by the arms firmly, terrifying So-hee. Back at the apartment, while eating, the group discuss their plan to do necromancy. Tae-soo explains that REM sleep is when humans are most likely to have an encounter with ghosts, and their test subject will be Yoon-jung, the one on whom they'll conduct the brainwave test. So-hee, who sits a few meters away from them, tries to convince them to ditch this agenda. She speaks slowly, seeming tired as she tells them the place has an unsettling atmosphere. So-hee tries to tell them about her experience back in the forest, but they don't let her complete her sentence. They try to assure her that everything will be fine, and that it's all just for fun, as there's no such thing as ghosts. Besides, she doesn't have to participate in anything, and could just be asleep while they do all the work. As nightfall approaches, the group set up all their equipment around the premises, including cameras. While the others begin the process of summoning the ghost inside, So-hee observes quietly from outside. The group gather around Yoon-jung, who is lying on the floor, her eyes tightly shut and covered in salt. They begin to say a spell, summoning the ghost, with a radio on the table to help detect the arrival of any spirit, as its frequency would change if there were to be a supernatural presence in their midst. Just when their efforts appear to be futile, yielding underwhelming results as nothing extraordinary happens, Tae-soo turns to So-hee, justifying his claims that ghosts don't exist and there is nothing to be afraid of. He calls for Yoon-jung, who is still lying on the floor motionless and her eyes shut, but she doesn't respond. Suddenly, as if under control of something, she tilts her head to the back and begins shaking and whimpering. The others, concerned and terrified, run to the circle of salt where she is laid. They call for her, confused about her state. And, in an anticlimactic moment, she opens her eyes and giggles. It's just a prank and she had them fooled. As time goes on, the group slowly becomes bored as nothing out of the ordinary has occurred yet, so they sit and wait. Eventually, the boys grow tired of watching the cameras. Tae-soo advises Sang-yob to go keep So-hee, who is all by herself, company. As Sang-yob leaves, Tae-soo goes to keep Yoon-jung, who is lying down alone in the circle of the salt company. Sang-yob gets to the room where So-hee is. As he enters, So-hee immediately pleads with him to stay with her. Meanwhile, Han Se-ok, who is out in the bushes urinating, hears something. He is immediately on the alert, and so he takes out his torch and points. In the bushes, he finds a weird-looking black bird that immediately flies away. Letting his curiosity get the best of him, Han Se-ok goes after the bird. Han Se-ok runs through the darkness, using his torchlight to guide his way. However, the bird is quicker than him, and he's unable to catch up with the swift animal. It rushes into one of the rooms and Han Se-ok follows it inside. Frustrated at his failed attempts to catch the strange bird, Han Se-ok catches a quick glimpse of the animal going under a hole. So, he immediately rushes to that hole, bending over and pointing his bright light into it. However, there's no bird in sight. Eventually, Han Se-ok walks out of the room unsuccessful and full of regrets, especially because he was unable to get the bird on camera. He walks back to where the computers are and takes a seat, wondering why no one is there. As he sits, he looks at the computer screen, and on it is live footage of Yoon-jung and Tae-soo in an intimate position, kissing. Meanwhile, Sang-yob and So-hee still lay on the floor in awkward silence. Sang-yob inquires if So-hee feels cold as it's raining outside, but she randomly grabs his shirt, trembling and her hands shaky. She asks him if he can hear the sound, indicating that there is another presence in their midst. Sang-yob is utterly confused by her strange behavior, as he has no clue about what she speaks of. Just then, a hand that Sang-yob does not see reaches out to So-hee's mouth and covers it. On the other hand, Han Se-ok, who still sits by the computer, observing the whole scene, suddenly notices something very strange. The frequency begins to count down from 3.2 MHz. Han Se-ok's attention is immediately brought to it as he watches the frequency drop down to 0.0 MHz. At that moment, the atmosphere becomes unsettling. The main door opens, and Yoon-jung walks out of it. With her head bowed, she begins to move in another direction. Disturbed and concerned at the same time, Han Se-ok runs to her, inquiring where she's headed. As Yoon-jung turns around, she's not the same anymore as her eyes are plain white. The sight of this alone gives Han Se-ok a jump scare, but fortunately for him, he has only been hallucinating. However, Yoon-jung is nowhere to be found in reality. Tae-soo and Han Se-ok are out looking for her, as they fear the unknown. Han Se-ok finds Sang-yob and asks him to come out of the room and help. Just as Sang-yob informs So-hee that he's about to leave, So-hee grabs himself again and begs him not to leave. On the other hand, Tae-soo finds Yoon-jung in a room backing him. He's slightly relieved to see her as he expresses how concerned he was by her sudden disappearance. Han Se-ok arrives too, panting loudly. He also is relieved to see Yoon-jung. As Yoon-jung turns around, she begins to twitch, begging that they help her. The two, Tae-soo and Han Se-ok, are confused by this weird behavior, and it becomes weirder when Yoon-jung falls to the ground and begins to crawl on the floor like an animal. It's quite a disturbing scene. Yoon-jung crawls under a tiny hole, and Tae-soo immediately rushes to her, trying to stop her from going in it entirely. Han Se-ok rushes to give Tae-soo a hand, and the two together struggle to pull Yoon-jung out of the hole. It's almost a battle trying to prevent Yoon-jung, who is already halfway through the hole, from entering into it completely. The two are relentless, and eventually they pull Yoon-jung out of the hole, but to their dismay, she has been covered up by some hair spirit with red eyes. The two are instantly terrified as Han Se-ok runs away from Yoon-jung, and instantly, Yoon-jung is pulled into the hole completely. Han Se-ok is taken aback by this unsettling encounter. He is almost in tears as he reminds Tae-soo that the figure they had just seen fits the description of the tales they had heard from the other students. Now without Yoon-jung, Tae-soo suggests that they leave immediately. Han Se-ok can't get any signal on his phone, so there's no way they could call for help. Tae-soo instructs Sang-yob to take So-hee to the car, and for Han Se-ok to pack up their equipment while he goes to rescue Yoon-jung. Quite a bold move by Tae-soo. As the tension as well as the rain builds, they go their separate ways, each with a tough task of their own. Sang-yeob successfully takes an unconscious So-hee to the vehicle and rushes back to the apartment to help the others. On the other hand, Han Seok is busy trying to gather all their equipment as they plan their escapade when suddenly, Yoon Jung's voice begins to play on the radio, laying on the floor. Tae-soo arrives in time to hear its words. At first, the voice sounds like a cry for help, but then it quickly shifts to life-threatening words. Instantly triggered, Tae-soo lands a large rock on the radio which breaks it into pieces. Han Seok, still shaking and whimpering, reminds Tae-soo that in necromancy, only the deceased can be heard on the radio. Tae-soo rushes to Han Seok and tries to silence him, refusing to entertain the possibility of Yoon Jung being gone forever. In his distress, he even blames everything that has occurred on Han Seok and threatens Han Seok's life if Yoon Jung has been harmed in any way. Outside, the rain continues to pour heavily. Tae-soo, still desperate to rescue his lover, tries to reach where she has been trapped from above. Luckily, he gets help from Sang-yeob, and together they begin to throw rocks on the floor, hoping to crack the place open. Their efforts are not in vain, and they manage to pull Yoon Jung out of where she has been trapped. They rush her to the vehicle, ready to leave as all their equipment has been packed and Yoon Jung is safe with them. However, to Han Seok's dismay, the doll hasn't been burnt, and so he demands that they burn the doll urgently. Tae-soo claims Han Seok caused all this, and he asks Han Seok to go back inside and finish what he started. Upset, Han Seok leaves, and within a few moments, he returns. Tae-soo asks if he had successfully burnt the doll, and he affirms it. However, that's a lie, as he threw the doll into the ditch Yoon Jung was trapped in earlier, rather than burn it. Tae-soo drives them off, and they eventually arrive at a hospital where they admit Yoon Jung. Tae-soo volunteers to stay back at the hospital and monitor Yoon Jung, while he encourages the rest to get a hotel so they can have some rest. The three arrive at the hotel, and just before they each get into their rooms, Sang-yeob stops So-hee to ask her why she behaved and talked strangely earlier, especially when she insisted that they burnt the doll back at the apartment. So, he waves him off and asks him to get some sleep. Meanwhile, Han Seok intends to exploit the whole situation. He calls a production company, as he intends to send footage of their encounter to the producer at no simple fee. On the other hand, Sang-yeob is having trouble sleeping. He has a nightmare as a mysterious figure tries to strangle him in his sleep. Later, Han Seok goes to visit Tae-soo and Yoon Jung at the hospital. There he apologizes to Tae-soo for bringing up necromancy, and blames himself for the traumatic experience they all faced, landing Yoon Jung on a hospital bed now. Tae-soo holds no grudge and reassures him that Yoon Jung will be alright. Han Seok then asks if Tae-soo has had anything to eat since the previous night. When he says no, he volunteers to keep an eye on Yoon Jung, while he goes to find something to eat. Tae-soo is grateful for Han Seok's kind gesture, and so he leaves. When Han Seok confirms that Tae-soo has left the premises, he begins to confess his undying love to Yoon Jung. He is upset as he wonders why Yoon Jung has always preferred Tae-soo to him. Han Seok, insensitive to Yoon Jung's state, goes ahead and kisses her on her neck. Just as he does, the hair spirit slowly crawls out of Yoon Jung's body and covers up Han Seok's face. Later, Sang-yeob and So-hee go out to eat. While they chat, Sang-yeob shares the nightmare he had earlier. Just then, Sang-yeob gets a call and the caller has some news. Yoon Jung is awake. Sang-yeob excitedly shares the news with So-hee. However, So-hee is rather indifferent to the information. Afterwards, the two go to visit Yoon Jung and Tae-soo at the hospital. Yoon Jung appears so high-spirited and suggests that they all have drinks at the hotel to celebrate their last night there. Yoon Jung notices that So-hee doesn't appear very excited to see her, and so she inquires why. So-hee just asks if Yoon Jung is sure she's okay, and Yoon Jung affirms that she's fine. As the group reunites, their attention is suddenly shifted to Han Seok's disappearance. They try to reach him, but he's unreachable. Later, the four have drinks and then part ways. That night, while So-hee brushes her teeth, she notices some reddish marks on her skin. Just then, she makes her way to Sang-yeob's room but doesn't find him there. Meanwhile, Sang-yeob, on the other hand, who is on his way back from the store, where he went to buy some snacks, gets a strange phone call from Yoon Jung instructing him to come to her room. Just as he hangs up, he sees Tae-soo hastily get into the vehicle. He calls for Tae-soo to wait, but he ignores him and zooms off. Slightly concerned about Tae-soo's sudden escape, Sang-yeob still makes his way to Yoon Jung's room. When he arrives, he calls for her, but he sees her sitting on her bed. As he enters fully into the room, she gets up from her bed and begins to walk up to him slowly. When the two are now face to face, Sang-yeob has a closer look at Yoon Jung and sees that her eyes are not normal. He just stares at her sternly, as if glued to her gaze. Meanwhile, Tae-soo, who mysteriously zoomed off earlier, has an episode in his car. He's alone in the vehicle but appears to be having a conversation with someone, and eventually, he crashes. Back in Yoon Jung's room, Sang-yeob is being interrogated by this strange spirit. He sees a little boy, his brother whom he had lost some time ago. Sang-yeob goes on his knees, overwhelmed with guilt as he pleads to his brother, who accuses him of neglect, leading to his demise. So-hee, on the other hand, is going through the footage that was taken back at the apartment. As she watches closely, she sees how Yoon Jung was possessed by the doll. She rushes to Yoonjung's room and arrives just in time to stop Sang-yeob from hanging. Under the influence of the spirit, the atmosphere calms, and the spirit leaves. However, Sang-yeob has trouble remembering what had happened to him, so he wastes no time in informing him that Yoonjung has been possessed by a spirit. Sang-yeob is taken aback by this and begins to question everything, like Han Seok, who mysteriously disappeared and they haven't heard from him since. Just like that, bodies begin to turn up. The remainder of the group are in tears as they realize that they have tragically lost their two friends, Han Seok and Tai-soo. Later, So-hee and Yoonjung sit down to talk. Yoonjung has more disheartening news to hear. So-hee reveals to her that she's possessed by a ghost and that whenever she falls asleep, the ghost has full control over her, and the next time it has control over her, Sang-yeob, and her will be next. And they'll end up just like Han Seok and Tae-soo. Yoonjung can't help but feel guilty for the tragic passing of her friends, and worse, the pattern is set to continue once she falls asleep. She demands that they all stay far away from her, for their own safety. She even feels more devastated when she realizes that no one would believe her even if she went seeking help. So-hee further reveals that there is only one solution for them. Her mother is a shaman, and she had told her that once an individual is possessed, the ghost will exercise full authority over their body. The only way to end this tragedy is if they return to that apartment. The three begin their journey back to the apartment in the middle of the night. Sang-yeob drives, while So-hee sits in the back with Yoonjung, making sure that she doesn't fall asleep. Upon arrival, So-hee tells Sang-yeob and Yoonjung to head to the apartment first, and that she'll join them later. As she sits in the car, she calls her mom, who has been very worried about her. They have an emotional conversation, which ends on an uncertain note. As the call ends, So-hee turns to a mysterious old lady who is seated beside her. She asks for reassurance from the woman about her help, and the woman confirms. At the apartment, So-hee, alongside Yoonjung, perform the same ritual they had done earlier to summon the ghost. Yoonjung lies in a circle of salt, while So-hee tears open her palm and dips the blood into a bowl of water. After, she goes outside to where Sang-yeob is seated, and she instructs him that whatever happens, he shouldn't go into the room. Sang-yeob agrees, and just as So-hee heads back into the apartment, So-hee calls for her. He informs her that she is the real reason why he joined the club. So-hee smiles widely at this revelation and heads back into the apartment. As they wait, suddenly the room begins to shake, and there's a strong presence of the supernatural. So-hee is possessed by an old ghostly spirit. The ghost, now dwelling in So-hee's body, demands that the ghost possessing Yoonjung come out of her. It's a long back and forth between the two spirits, as the other ghost in Yoonjung's body refuses to leave. The tense moment becomes rather dramatic as Yoonjung's body elevates off the ground and begins to land on various corners of the room. Suddenly all the light goes off, and the ghost dwelling in Yoonjung's body still insists on staying. On the other hand, Sang-yeob, who is outside, begins to hear a cry for help from his brother. He slowly walks to the door and slightly pushes it open. He then sees his little brother on the floor, and So-hee's arms round about his neck. He then rushes to So-hee, pushes her off him, and puts his arms around her neck tightly, preventing her from breathing. Struggling for survival, So-hee pleads for Sang-yeob to stop, reassuring him that his brother forgave him. Slowly, Sang-yeob comes to the realization that it has all been mind games by the ghost all along, exploiting the guilt he feels for his brother's passing and using it to manipulate him. Just then, Sang-yeob feels something creep behind him. As he turns around, he sees the terrifying figure that is immediately set to attack. The three attempt to escape, but Sang-yeob is caught, unfortunately. So-hee rushes inside to save Sang-yeob, but he is dragged down by the spirit. Just as the spirit overwhelms Sang-yeob with its hair, Sang-yeob manages to take out his lighter and burn the doll hanging above him. As a result, the whole underground explodes. So-hee, who observed the whole scene pan out from above, is left devastated as she continually calls for Sang-yeob, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she will get a response. So-hee is in tears as she keeps calling for Sang-yeob, and just when she is left in despair, a hand touches her from behind. She turns around and sees Sang-yeob, alive and well. Sang-yeob slightly teases that if he were any fatter, chances are he wouldn't have survived. So-hee is pleased to see him, and she immediately reaches to hug him. The three journey out of the house, grateful to have come out of it alive. As time passes, So-hee and Sang-yeob appear to have moved on from the traumatic experience they faced at the haunted apartment. They meet up at the cafe and briefly chat. They talk about Yoonjung wanting to meet up with them later. So-hee tells Sang-yeob to wait for her to finish her shift so they can go together. However, Sang-yeob declines, preferring to meet up there instead. Hinting at their relationship, So-hee deems it odd of Sang-yeob and jokes about him possibly cheating on her. However, Sang-yeob claims to be meeting a publisher with whom he had shown half of his book, and that the publisher offered to have his book published. This is good news to So-hee as she reaches out to hug him. Just then, Sang-yeob gets a call from the publisher, and he excuses himself to take the call outside. As he leaves, So-hee has a look at Sang-yeob's computer. She intends to take a glimpse of the book he's writing, but instead finds a video, and then decides to play it. The content of the clip is Sang-yeob getting possessed by the spirit from the apartment. So-hee is terrified as she watches the video play. Just then, Sang-yeob returns and touches So-hee's shoulders. She's filled with fear and shaky as she slowly shuts the laptop. As So-hee slowly turns around to face the man behind her, the film comes to an abrupt end.